Okay, time for another true life transsexual story. Um, as I figured, the reason I haven't told my story that much before is the response I had from some people about my first story, the childhood in hell, was a feeling of general disbelief or a feeling that maybe I exaggerated. It's true, people do tend to exaggerate hardship stories, but I don't because in order to get anybody to even listen, I'd have to minimize it to make it less than it really was because nobody really wants to believe that any children could be subjected to what they were and probably still are. So, because of that, I'm going to tell another story. Story about the first friend I made at Shriners Hospital. Let me ask you first, do you see a children's hospital as a place for healing or young? Or as a place to dump hopeless, helpless children to die alone and unloved and out of sight, till their families are spared the discomfort of watching them suffer and die? We live in a society of self-centered adults that treat the lonely and the suffering, the helpless ones that need them the most, by stripping them away from everything that gives them comfort, their home, family, neighborhood, to warehouse them in sterile, lifeless, unfriendly places like convalescent hospitals, mental health wards, and even children's hospitals like Shriners Hospital for crippled children in San Francisco, where I spent so much of my childhood. Places that, for many kids, offer no tangible help, possibly worth everything they lose in being there, except to spare the bother of their family, having the burden of caring for them or seeing their loved ones in pain and suffering, leaving them to suffer alone. And the family delude themselves into thinking they're doing what's best. And damn you all for abandoning them. My story, I and 6 children like me, started out different from most of the children I met at the hospital. Because all of us, until we entered that house of horrors, were actually in very good health and good medical condition. It wasn't until we received the wonderful medical treatment they offered us that it killed all the rest of the children and ruined my life. But that was a story in chapter 1. And this story is about most of the other children that weren't so lucky. So many of them who had little or no chance of living. As Shriners, it seemed to me, looking through the eyes of an adult and a child, there were 2 types of patients. There were some, like myself, that were admitted for an otherwise costly or long-term treatment that would make some doctor's reputation if it worked. If it didn't, we could be brushed under the table like other lost experiments. For the other class of patients, though, it was a kind of hospital of last resort where eligible children were sent after other hospitals gave up on them. And tragically, there were a lot, way too many children who fitted this category. This is the story of my first friend there, one such boy. All of us children had one thing in common. We all hated that hospital and the cold, emotionless monsters who worked there. I mean, the nurses had been taught to heal humans at the cost of their own humanity and the compassion that led them to want to be healers in the first place. They totally ignored our pain and loneliness. They knew that way too many of us were going to die there in that hellhole. And they protected themselves by not getting emotionally involved, even with children who were so desperately in need of love and affection. In the 7 years I was condemned to that place, the only nurse I ever saw shed a single tear for any of us was my nurse Nancy, I talked about in the first video. She cried long and openly for me They held me in their arms the day I found out my Teresa had died. All the other doctors and nurses could have been robots. We were also united in our belief that we'd been betrayed by our families, who had taken us there and abandoned us, left us to die in that horrible place, where our childhood innocence was quickly shattered as we watched other children in the ward die, learned about death close up. Anyway, my very first real hospital friend was an awful long way from home, coming from some small town in Georgia. I was in the main ward of the East Wing, which is where they put the youngest boys. I'd not been butchered by the surgeons yet because they were still running tests. And they put my bed next to this other boy's in the far corner of the ward. Most of the other boys avoided him, wouldn't go near there, because he was burned over most of his body, and he gave off a very unpleasant odor. The first thing he said to me was to apologize, because he was embarrassed. He knew he smelled bad and looked abhorrent, and he felt he had to apologize for it. I told him that wasn't fair. No reason to be ashamed, it wasn't his fault. Since I was the new kid on the block and didn't know anybody yet, we started talking, got to know each other. In the 1960s, most people would not have thought that the girlish little kid from California and the big tough black kid from Georgia would have a lot in common. But we both missed our mothers. We were scared to death of this godforsaken place. We just wanted to go home. When I first saw him, he was severely burned, but he was whole. He said he wasn't in too much pain because the nerve endings of most of his skin had been destroyed, and they were giving him morphine. Then, without ever fully explaining why, they took him into surgery late one night and amputated his hands and feet. When he woke up, he was in such despair, knowing he had no limbs, no chance for a normal life. He couldn't even cry. He had no tear ducts left. So I cried for him. And I promised him I'd be his best friend. I tried to be hands and feet, holding his juice glass and feeding him. Lord, he had no lips left. And I watched him grow weaker and just give up on a world that had no place for him. I was the only one there when he died, and the only one there that mourned him. It just wasn't right. Why couldn't he leave him whole? I'd have to cut him up. Why couldn't he die at home, the place he loved, the people he knew, and his little Scotch terrier? He wanted to be at home with the people he used to think loved him. I was only a 7-year-old child. I tried my best, but I didn't know what to say. He should have been in his mother's arms. I'd never seen death before, but it wasn't the last time in that hellish place.